Mr. Sergeant at Arms, invite the members into the chamber and close the doors. I hereby declare the House of Representatives of the 112th General Assembly of the State of Tennessee now in session. Will the members please stand? Will the visitors in gallery please stand and remain standing to the Pledge of Allegiance? Representative Manis will introduce the chaplain of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored this morning to have our guest. I want to just share a little story with you. Coming up this Sunday is Mother's Day. My mother's birthday was this past Friday, the 30th. She shares a birthday with our esteemed chairman, Vaughn. Maybe just a few years before him, she was born. My mother passed away 5 years ago this year. And it was special to me to have her pastor come and lead the devotion this morning. My mother was raised in an orphanage. Her mother died when she was really young, and she had two younger sisters, and she was raised in an orphanage. And she's probably the only person in history that was thrown out of an orphanage. She was a fighter. She took up for her younger sisters, and she fought for them every day, and she wouldn't let anybody abuse them, to her detriment of being thrown out of the orphanage. So I say that to say, you can imagine, you don't know my mother, but if you knew her, how hard it would be to pastor this lady. She was the strongest lady, strong-willed, great lady, and I have great admiration for her pastor. So it's a pleasure to have Reverend Mike Seegers from Inskip Baptist Church this morning with us.
Thank you, Eddie. And it is an honor to be here on 2 or 3 occasions. One, to be a part of the great state of Tennessee and be a part of this time and a part of Eddie's life and family. And also, I don't know that any of you would remember, but my father-in-law was also a state representative from Knoxville, and he served from 1968 to 1976. And his name was Tom Jensen. And I don't know if any of you remember my father-in-law. I see some heads shaking. He probably owed you all money, and I apologize for that. But every time he was able to get his desk, and his desk, my dad-in-law passed away a couple of years ago, but his desk is still at the home of my mother-in-law, Carolyn. So it's an honor to be here. The scripture that I want to share a scripture and read a little poem/prayer that I came across, and then have a word of prayer. It's 2 Chronicles 15:7. But as for you, be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded. Now, I know this doesn't happen in politics, but sometimes in the ministry, you feel like you work and work and work sometimes, and you're not really sure if your work gets rewarded. But I'm sure that, I'm joking, of course. Stay at it, be strong, trust God, your work will be rewarded. Lord, help us in the midst of violence, anger, hatred, gunshots, and screams to prevent lives lost, unwanted deaths resulting in unfulfilled dreams. Lord, help us to seek your wisdom, your presence, and your unwavering grace to grab hold of the monumental issues and circumstances that we all now face. Lord, help us to look for peace and strength, hope, justice by looking in your word, sharing your guidance, your ideas, your hope in ways which have yet to be heard. Lord, help us to lock arms with each other, standing strong and ready to share, understanding that the killings and violence and senseless deaths also bring you great despair. Lord, help us not to blame just one group of people and stop pointing fingers at one another, but despite our skin color, our age, or profession, be united as sisters and brothers. Lord, help us all to take a deep and serious look inside our own hearts and ask, are our actions and attitudes going to make things worse, or is this where healing starts? Lord, help us all to look deep within our hearts and souls and mind, and let understanding, kindness, unity, and community be what we all find. Lord, help us to look past circumstances, situations that have gone so wrong, and help us to all bond together as one and singing a different song. Lord, please help us that no more lives, young or old, will be taken away, and every group, organization, and family look and trust in you for a new and better day. Lord, help us. Pray with me. Thank you, God, again for this time and these folks here. And I pray that not only that they will reach across the aisle with each other for the greater good of our state, but reach up to you, Lord Jesus, who died on a cross for our sins. And I pray that every person that's hearing this knows that they know you as their Savior and Lord. And we thank you for that. Again, thank you for this time and this privilege and honor that I have got to have in this place with these great people. Bless them. Put your hand upon them. Forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' precious name we pray. And all God's people said.
Amen.
Representative Manis will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Attention, salute, pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Clerk, please take the roll.
Roll call.
Mr. Clerk, please take the roll.
Mr. Speaker, 89 members present.
Let the journal reflect Representatives Byrd, Carter, Cooper, Holsley, Griffey are excused. Next order, Mr. Clerk.
Welcoming and honoring.
Welcome and honoring. Members, we have a presentation, so just hold tight. Representative Love, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request that the Sergeant of Arms escort our guests into the chamber.
Mr. Sergeant of Arms, escort the guests to the well, please. Representative Love, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request that the clerk read the resolution.
Mr. Clerk, please read the resolution.
House Resolution 44 by Representative Love, a resolution honoring and congratulate Eddie George on becoming the new head football coach at Tennessee State University. Whereas we are most pleased to welcome star football player, successful businessman, and compassionate philanthropist Eddie George to the TSU family as the head coach of the football program. And whereas Eddie George has proven himself to be a winner in every aspect of life, and we are certain that his winning ways will translate to the TSU football team and its future success, both on and off the field. And whereas most importantly, Eddie George will serve as an exemplary role model for these young men as they seek to become responsible and productive citizens, in addition to attaining success on the gridiron. And whereas Coach George will also demonstrate the importance of maintaining one's peak physical, mental, and spiritual condition to meet the challenges of both college athletics and life. And whereas we are most certain that Eddie George will channel his passion and pride to continue the proud TSU football legacy founded by Coach John A. Merritt and continued by so many others. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives of the 112th General Assembly of the State of Tennessee that we honor and congratulate Eddie George on becoming the new head football coach at Tennessee State University and extend to him our best wishes for much success and satisfaction in his new job.
Representative Love, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there's really not much more I can say, but that we are certainly excited to congratulate Coach George on his new assignment here at Tennessee State. I do want to recognize we have with us the president of Tennessee State, Dr. Glenda Baskin Glover. We also have with us Senator Brenda Gilmore, and I want to turn the mic over now, if I can, Speaker, to the athletic director and then to Coach George after that, if that's possible, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning. This is a tremendous honor. I'm the Director of Athletics, Dr. Mickey Allen, and on behalf of the state of Tennessee, and I appreciate all the service and leadership that you all do for this proud state. It's an exciting time on 3500 John Merritt Boulevard. We have someone that understands the legacy of our proud program at Tennessee State. And, Eddie George wakes up with that tenacity, that fire in his belly to be great. And for an athletic director and for Dr. Glover being the president, we know we have a leader of our football program that's going to have a transformational impact, not only with our young men in our football program, but our university at large. And that's so pleasing and gratifying to us that we have a winner. We have someone that has a great football mind and someone that's committed to the holistic development of our young people, not only in our football program, but again, our university at large. So thank you for this tremendous honor, congratulating him on his appointment, and I'll let Coach speak.
Wow. Good morning. Dr. Allen, thank you so much. And Dr. Glover, thank you for hiring me and handing me the keys to this wonderful university in terms of being the head football coach. Thank you guys for your service for our wonderful state and what you do and your leadership. I'm truly honored. The last 30, 60 days have been an emotional roller coaster for me. I was hired as a head coach. Only 2 weeks later to lose my father. And then last week to celebrate my wife's 50th birthday. So I've been literally on a high, on a roller coaster, but this is a wonderful, tremendous honor for me. And I just aim to bring prominence and greatness to this great university and raise it to another level. Thank you so much, and go Big Blue. Thank you.
Representative Love.
Speaker, if you would do us the tremendous honor of coming down here so we can get a picture with you and the whole crew and Coach George, if you would, please, Speaker.
Members, we're in welcoming and honoring anyone seeking recognition. Chairman Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have news of other championships, but I'll let that lie for now. But all the way from the District of Champions is my family. My wife, Jonna, my son, Grayson, and my dear, dear friend, Annie Parker, came all the way up to watch us do some work today.
Representative Carringer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to say, may the 4th be with you all.
Anyone else seeking recognition under welcome and honoring? Leader Camper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, yesterday my dad celebrated his 90th birthday. I meant to mention it yesterday, but I got busy. And we had a birthday party for him last night. It was wonderful. So if you would join me in congratulating my dad on his 90th birthday. Thank you, members.
Representative Calfee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank everybody that participated in the baby shower yesterday. And that's hard for me to say since our youngest grandchild's 15 years old. But I thank you for your love and support. And one of you got to spend some time with Sawyer. You know why he's so precious to me in Maryland. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any others? Next order, Mr. Clark.
Introduction to resolutions.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move that all resolutions properly filed be introduced pursuant to rule number 17 and placed on the consent calendar and referred to the appropriate standing committee.
Without objection, so ordered. Next order, Mr. Clark.
Senate Joint Resolutions congratulatory and memorializing.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move that all Senate joint resolutions congratulatory and memorializing in line with that has to be placed on the consent calendar pursuant to rule number 17.
Without objection, so ordered. Next order, Mr. Clark.
Resolutions lying over.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move that all resolutions lying over be referred to the appropriate standing committee.
Without objection, so ordered. Next order, Mr. Clark.
Introduction of bills, Senate bills on first consideration, Senate bills on second consideration, House bills on second consideration, petitions and memorials, reports of standing committees, reports of select committees, calendars. Mr. Speaker, the House has a consent calendar.
Chairman Zachary, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of the consent calendar on third and final consideration in keeping with Rule 50.
Gentleman moves passage of the consent calendar, properly seconded. Mr. Clerk, any objections been filed?
Mr. Speaker, no objections filed.
Anyone seeking recognition on the consent calendar? Representative Littleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After consulting with both leaders, I move that all members voted in the affirmative be added to co-prime sponsors to HJR 574 and HJR 575, items number 21 and 22.
Exclusions duly noted. Without objection, so ordered. Anyone else seeking recognition? Leader Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After consulting with the minority leader, if we can have all members voting in the affirmative added as co-prime sponsors to HJR number 619, item 65 on the calendar.
Exclusions duly noted. Without objection, so ordered. Anyone else seeking recognition? Seeing none, we are voting on the consent calendar. All members in favor vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 90, no nays.
Having received the constitutional majority, I declare the consent calendar passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Next order, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, the House has a regular calendar.
Call the next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 718 by Chairman Keisling and others relative to elderly and vulnerable adults. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the list.
Chairman Keisling, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1228.
Chairman Keisling moves to substitute and conform Senate Bill 1228 without objection. So ordered. Chairman Keisling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1228 on third and final consideration, please.
Chairman Keisling moves passage of Senate Bill 1228 on third and final consideration. By second, Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
Mr. Speaker, no amendments filed.
Chairman Keisling, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House Bill 718 and Senate Bill 1228, of course, is known as the Safe Seniors Act of 2021. Now, over the past 4 years, our General Assembly has overhauled Tennessee's law to help protect our vulnerable and elderly population. Over those years, we've identified some places that need to be cleaned up, but also some that need additional changes. Now, some of those, and I've got a short list of those without going into all the sections, 16 sections, but one, making the process easier to take an elderly adult's the disposition, making certain that adult protective services can make disclosures to prosecutors so that they can comply with current law, and allowing aggravated elderly abuse to be considered an offender that would be felony murder if the elderly adult dies. Now let's go to the Senate amendment. The amendment expands the definition of financial exploitation to include those situations where a caregiver takes the victim's money without their consent for the caregiver's own benefit, and two, changes the definition of physical harm to mean one, cause pain or injury, or two, would cause a reasonable person to suffer pain. Members, in summary, we believe that these changes will assist law enforcement and prosecutors, and to assist our judges in making sure that the sentences available to them upon conviction reflect the severity of the crime. And in closing, I want to salute both the folks, our executive director and assistant director, Guy Jones, Zoe Sams, at our district attorneys general's conference, and the committee that put this and saw this as a necessary tweak to our code now that there's been 4 years of past history. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll renew my motion, entertain any questions that any members may have.
Chairman Keesling renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1228 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member cast a vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? Camper aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 91, no nays.
Senate Bill 1228 having received constitutional majority, I hereby declare it passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1398 by Representative Helton and others relative to pharmacy benefits.
Chair Lady Helton, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 1398 on third and final consideration.
Chair Lady Helton moves passage. Properly seconded. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Insurance Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kumar, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to the Hill.
Without objection, roll to the Hill. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
House Finance Ways and Means Committee Amendment number 1, filed as House Amendment 2.
Chair Lady Hazelwood, you are recognized.
Speaker, I move adoption.
Chair Lady Hazelwood moves adoption. Amendment number 2, properly seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 2 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, the House is ready for further consideration of House Insurance Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kumar, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment that we just adopted incrementally improves the bill, so move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
No further amendments, Mr. Speaker.
Chair Lady Helton, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've lost my place. I am a little confused. I renew my motion.
Chair Lady Helton renews her motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none. Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 1398 as amended vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Powell, aye. Vaughn, aye. Stewart, aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 88, one nay, one present, not voted.
House Bill 1398, having received constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 430 by Leader Lamberth and others relative to sentencing for certain sexual offenses.
Leader Lamberth, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move passage of House Bill 430 on third and final consideration.
Leader Lamberth moves passage, properly seconded. Mr. Clerk, any amendments been filed?
Mr. Speaker, no amendments filed.
Leader Lamberth, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I renew my motion.
Leader Lamberth renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 430, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hardaway, aye. Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 89, no nays.
House Bill 430, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1047 by Representative Russell and others relative to criminal justice.
Representative Russell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 1047 on third and final consideration.
Representative Russell moves passage, probably seconded. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment number 1 makes the bill. Move to adopt.
Chairman Kershaw moves adoption of amendment number 1, properly seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative Russell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 1047 requires that after a conviction of certain crimes that historically target women and children, 100% of the imposed sentence must be served. Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Representative Russell renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 1047 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. Has every member cast a vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? Dogged aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 89, no nays.
House Bill 1047, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare it passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 910 by Representative Casta and others relative to public records.
Representative Cassidy, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. This move passage of House Bill 910 on third and final consideration.
Representative Cassidy moves passage, probably seconded. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House State Government Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kiesling, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment does rewrite the bill. We're going to defer to the sponsor for further explanation. We move to adopt, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Kiesling moves adoption of amendment number 1, probably seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
No further amendments, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cassidy, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, House Bill 910 was brought to me by my sheriff, and thus you see my friends from Williamson County have signed on with me. Additionally, the Tennessee Sheriff's Association endorses this bill, and it does a couple of basic things. If an individual is arrested, their home address, their telephone number, and their social security number is kept private, and that's what the bill does. So I renew my motion upon that explanation.
Representative Cassidy renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 910 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 88, no nays.
House Bill 910 having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1121 by Chairman Farmer relative to records involving abuse of children. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Chairman Farmer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 476.
Chairman Farmer moves to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 476. Probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Farmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 476 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Farmer moves passage of Senate Bill 476 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment Number 1. Mr. Speaker, it's the same as Senate Amendment Number 1.
Chairman Kershaw, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment Number 1 is in the Senate bill. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, Amendment Number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendment.
Chairman Farmer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, what this does, it creates a Class A misdemeanor for folks to come in and try to obtain confidential records of child sexual abuse or neglect. And I renew my motion.
Chairman Farmer renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 476 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member cast a vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 89, no nays.
Senate Bill 476, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. Without objection, the motion reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1339 by Representative Ogles and others relative to witness testimony. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on desk.
Representative Ogles, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1231.
Representative Ogles moves substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1231. Probably second without objection. So ordered. Representative Ogles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage Senate Bill 1231 on third and final consideration.
Representative Ogles moves passage of Senate Bill 1231 on third and final consideration. Probably second. And Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment Number 1. Mr. Speaker, same as Senate Amendment Number 1.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment Number 1 is in the Senate bill. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, Amendment Number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative Ogles, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill defines what a forensic analyst is and allows for forensic analysts to testify remotely in court proceedings only if all the parties agree. So you have to get agreements by all parties, and if that's agreed by all parties and the courts, they can give their testimony remotely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I renew my motion.
Representative Ogles renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1231 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member casts their vote, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 93, no nays.
Senate Bill 1231, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 580 by Chairman Reagan and others relative to education. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Chairman Reagan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 623.
Chairman Reagan moves substitute and conform to Senate Bill 623. Probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 623 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Reagan moves passage of 623 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Education Administration Committee Amendment Number 1.
Chairman White, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to the Hill of the amendments.
Without objection, roll to the Hill. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
House Education Administration Committee Amendment Number 2.
Chairman White, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move to adopt and defer to the sponsor for explanation.
Chairman White moves adoption of amendment number 2. Probably seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 2 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, that brings the body back to the heel of the amendments. Education Administration Committee Amendment Number 1.
Chairman White, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Reagan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, I bring before you today House Bill 580, a bill when originally filed last session was a cleanup bill. As all of you know, we routinely introduce cleanup bills to clarify inconsistent wording between recent legislation and older code portions. Additionally, these types of bills correct petty grammar and spelling mistakes, delete outdated code references, and make little changes to reverse a minor unintended consequence here or there. Sometimes we use these cleanup bills to align different code portions to make legislative purpose more obvious or easier to understand. As a case in point, 52 of the 53 sections of House Bill 580 make the typical insignificant but necessary adjustments to our education code to do exactly what I have described. However, one section of this bill clarifies a very important portion of our education code. At the end of this month, we celebrate Memorial Day. It is a day when we mark the sacrifices of our heroes who gave their all in defending our Constitution, a document intended to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and secure the blessings of liberties to ourselves and our posterity. These sacrifices and these phrases are made all the more poignant by the oath we swear at the beginning of every General Assembly. In a sense, that oath echoes at the beginning of every floor session when we pledge our allegiance to our republic, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. No matter where any of us live in our state, we are all proud Tennesseans. We who live in Tennessee are also proud Americans. We are one state, we are one nation. Unfortunately, there are those self-appointed guardians of equity among us who deludedly seek to make our union far less perfect. In shameless pursuit of political power, these misguided souls leverage social, cultural, and religious factors to fracture our indivisible nation. To create artificial divisions among us, these self-styled noble champions of the oppressed unashamedly distort and twist the truth. Perhaps the greatest shared truth and theological doctrine found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Truly, I believe every individual human being is created in the image of God. This truth cannot be distorted. Perhaps the greatest political truth is the most well-known line written by Thomas Jefferson, found in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Undeniably, I believe all Americans are created equal and possess these rights. This truth must never be twisted. In 1789, the United States Constitution inaugurated a unique form of transformational government created of the people, by the people, and for the people. This timeless document still stands as a guiding light for all those around the world who believe in divinely bestowed individual rights and equal opportunity. With this document, the political geniuses who were our founders set before our nation a glorious, unprecedented vision of our nation's liberty. Ronald Reagan likened the implementation of that vision to our nation being a shining city on a hill. However, our founders, notwithstanding their political genius, were imperfect people living in imperfect times. Consequently, our state and nation have traveled a complicated path thus far in our pursuit of becoming a shining city on the hill. As a result, I believe we have much work left for our children to be able to realize the full promise of our nation. To fulfill that promise, our children must be educated that they stand as individuals, equal before our laws, as they will one day stand before their Creator. They must learn their identity is defined by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, their sex, ethnicity, or membership in some social class. Our nation has never been perfect, nor will ever be so. Nonetheless, as President Bill Clinton noted, there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured with what is right in America. Therefore, it is time that we support educating our children and fixing what is wrong with America with what is right with America. So today, I encourage every member to unite in voting for this legislation, ensuring that all individuals and segments of our society are treated equally, including in K through 12 curriculum, courses such as history, civics, social studies, and similar topics. We must create an educational climate where every student is an individual, not just part of some group. Moreover, that educational climate must teach students that they can realize their own unique dreams through hard work and meritorious achievement. We are committed to those principles here in Tennessee. That is why the language of Section 51 to this amendment has been added. With that explanation, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion and stand ready to answer questions.
Chairman Reagan renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Hardaway, you're recognized.
Thank you, Speaker Sexton. And to the sponsor, I'd certainly appreciate your prologue and the delivery of the same. However, when we get to the explanation of the legislation itself, does it tie the hands of the educators in presenting both sides of the argument? That argument being what you cited earlier, a more perfect union, and where we are in achieving the same.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To answer your question directly, no, I do not believe it does.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you, Speaker Sexton. Let me ask a different question then. Does your legislation speak to critical race theory?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Critical race theory is not mentioned anywhere in this legislation.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you. Did critical race theory play a part in the genesis of this legislation?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am not sure that I understand your question since no one has defined critical race theory for me.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you, Speaker. So if it hasn't been defined, then it certainly cannot be prohibited by this
critical race theory.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you. And I appreciate you reminded me of what you said, but my question, sir, is whether the concept of critical race theory, and I'm pretty sure that you understand the general concept, would that be prohibited in public education, K-12 especially, for teachers to engage their students?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the straightforward answer to your question, sir, is teachers are already supposed to be teaching what is in our Tennessee state standards. House Bill 580, and particularly the portion that's been added, emphasizes that the Tennessee state standards are what are to guide our instructors in choosing what goes into their classrooms, whether it's their lessons or supplemental material.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you. I think there are others who are probably going to more vigorously pursue this question. So I'm merely going to state my position on what happens when we restrict the freedom of our educators to present the full picture of history, especially in terms of the history of the United States of America, in terms of the imperfect beginning, in terms of the ideals not being met, which is why we have the amendments that we have. We know that Black folks were written in to be counted as 3/5 of the population of a citizen in terms of for population purposes. We know that without the 14th Amendment, that Black folks would still be chattel, would still be enslaved. We know that the Civil War was fought for the same. Now there's Two sides to every story, but to some stories, there's only one truth, no matter how many sides there are. And I would suggest to you that taking the discussion of race, ethnicity, discrimination, biases out of the classroom does a disservice not merely to the students, but to the very principles that our country was formed on. We cannot achieve a more perfect union without recognizing, acknowledging, confronting the imperfections. Those imperfections sometimes make folks uncomfortable. And it doesn't matter who you are, black, white, brown, or other. The very discussion makes some uncomfortable. But I will tell you that there's no way to keep working and to keep moving forward on that journey towards a more perfect union and achieving freedom for all until we acknowledge the imperfections, until we address the imperfections and do what we have to do to, in our hearts and our minds, to live up to the principles that this country was founded on. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the sponsor for indulging me.
Chairman Reagan, you have anything to add, sir?
Thank you for your comments.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Sponsor, for your indulgence. And thank you also for the label of the noble champions of the oppressed. I wear that label proudly. I am a champion of the oppressed, or for the oppressed. In your preamble, in your prologue, you mentioned that all men are created equal. And I think you agree with that. Am I correct?
Chairman Reagan.
Correct, sir.
Thank you. And let's just do a little history here. What year was that written? That all men are created equal?
Chairman Reagan.
You're referring to the Declaration of Independence, I assume. Obviously, it was written at the beginning of our struggle for independence from Britain. It was introduced on July 4th, I believe, 1776.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do you mind keeping our mics on?
No.
Thank you, sir. July 4th, 1776. What year, all men are created equal. What year was slavery introduced to the colonies?
Representative Parkinson, in consultation with the clerk, you're moving down about history. We're talking about a bill that's lined out. We'd be happy to take as many questions about the bill, but we kind of went through this the other day and a couple of days before about questioning things that are outside the bill. But if we can stick on the bill, please. Thank you. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was actually speaking to the bill, but the sponsor gave us a preamble and a prologue that had this information in it. And so I'm speaking to his preamble and prologue. And if that's okay, I really appreciate it if you'd allow me to continue to speak to that and in the bill, because I wouldn't have spoke to it had he not spoken about it.
We need to stay on the bill. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Sponsor, your vision, can you explain to us your vision for the bill as amended with this last amendment? So what do you see visually? How does this look to you?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. My vision for this portion of the amendment, which is section 50, is to ensure that Tennessee standards are taught in our classrooms as they are published on our state website. And I have copies of those if you're interested in that, but that is my vision.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Sponsor. In your vision to have the Tennessee standards taught, I think that's already in code to have the Tennessee standards taught. But does this bill, as amended with this last amendment, and I'm speaking specifically to the last amendment, to this last amendment that you gave your preamble and prologue for. Now, does it speak to how the standards are to be taught?
Chairman Reagan.
Again, I'm not sure I understand your question, sir. The standards are laid out, and the information that is in this is to establish clarity on those standards. Did that address your question?
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, it didn't. So let me be a little more specific. So inside of this amendment, it speaks to what can be talked about and how it's to be talked about impartially. Am I correct? Isn't there some language in there in that amendment that speaks to impartiality?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In section B, subparagraph 1 through 4, it does in fact allow impartial discussion of the controversial aspects of history, impartial instruction on the historical oppression of particular groups of people based on race, ethnicity, class, nationality, religion, or geographic region. Also in accordance with historical documents and the relevant subdivisions of B1 through 3 are permitted under 49.6.101.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Sponsor, for your indulgence. Impartial discussions. If we talk about the individuals that flew 2 planes into the World Banks in the classroom, based on the language in your amendment, that would mean that we have to talk about the good and the bad, I would assume, of about those pilots or those individuals that flew the planes into the World Banks. Can you give me an example of how a teacher would speak to the good about those individuals that flew those planes into the World Banks, the World Trade Centers, and killed over 3,000 Americans? What's the impartiality about the 2 individuals that flew the planes?
Chairman Reagan.
If I may, the impartiality is the statement of the facts that are not controversial. That is to say, those planes were flown into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, resulting in nearly 3,000 deaths. That is an impartial statement that has no advocacy or anything else associated with it.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Sponsor, I will submit to you that's one side of the story. Mr. Sponsor, in speaking to the Holocaust, what's the impartiality discussion about Hitler? How is that to be taught in the classroom impartially?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We already have within our state standards discussions on how to teach the Holocaust. In fact, State Standard 5.21 analyzes the significance of the Holocaust and its impacts on the U.S. It's clearly laid out in our standards, sir.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Sponsor, completely understandable, but in that discussion, you still have to talk about Hitler. You cannot talk about the Holocaust and not talk about Hitler. And how do you be impartial when discussing Adolf Hitler and his involvement in the Holocaust?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The impartiality is Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany and later assumed supreme leadership of that country, led it into World War II, and ordered the Holocaust. Those are facts. Those are impartial. There is no discussion on advocacy beyond that.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, I would respectfully disagree and respectfully point out to all of the supporters of Nazism and Hitler right here in the United States of America and in Tennessee. So there is another side from somebody. That's a fact. Mr. Sponsor, and Mr. Sponsor, and Mr. Speaker, I'm about to wrap this up. Where in your legislation how important is the truth in these discussions in our schools?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my learned friend here, history is a collection of facts that are taught. Truth is a philosophical concept. We teach facts. We then talk about the interpretation of those facts, which you may opine on what involves in truth. This bill does not address that, sir.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It does address it, and let me explain how it addresses it. Because if you do not allow all of the information to come forth, for whatever the reason is that you're bringing this, as a matter of fact, what is the reason that you're bringing this?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's to add clarity to our state standards for education.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Sponsor, that's not the answer that you gave us in committee yesterday, but I'm about to wrap it up. But the important thing here is and Chairman Reagan is, who I respect, Chairman Reagan, is that we cannot, no matter how much we try to legislate, we cannot suppress the truth. The truth is, we have a dynamic history in our state. It's dynamic. And the truth is, some of it is good, not just good, some of it is great. But the truth is also, some of it is abhorrible. And we can't suppress the horrific or the bad because it makes us uncomfortable. We need to tell the whole truth about our history in our state and our history in the United States, because it makes us a better people, a more perfect union. Your words, Mr. Sponsor. But we cannot become a more perfect union if we are not being honest and having conversations in truth. And this bill right here, as amended, takes away that opportunity for our children, our educators, to be able to have those conversations in truth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Thank you for your indulgence.
Representative Sapicki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was Abraham Lincoln, a politician from Illinois and the first Republican president, who reminded us that a house divided against itself cannot stand. We have made great progress as a state and a nation, but we have too many children still not reaching their potential in our schools, too many young adults in our prisons, and too many residents who believe government no longer works for them. We have passed some great legislation this session to address some of those challenges, and we must continue to strengthen the pipeline in education and employment opportunities for all citizens. Unfortunately, our citizens are more divided than ever, gridlocked over social issues, race, sex, and the economy. For many, they believe justice is no longer within their grasp. Our schools cannot add to the further division, especially division between or resentment of any race, sex, religion, creed, nonviolent political affiliation, social class, or class of people. We must be a colorblind society, and we must be colorblind in our schools. We should judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. We must impart these principles to the next generation. We cannot teach the next generation to feel guilt and anguish simply because of the color of their skin. We must work to ensure that no citizen, because of race or sex, experience an artificial barrier that prevents them from advancing upward in academics or career. Our state should never grant preferential treatment or discriminate against any individual or group based on race, sex, religion, creed, nonviolent political affiliation, social class, or class of people. When we teach our children to hate or fear, or teach them that someone of another race or sex is less important, we destroy the fabric of our nation. We know this country was founded by deeply flawed people who understood the fragility of our freedom, which was never more than one generation away from extinction. Tennessee, like America, may never be perfect, but generation after generation has shown that it can always be perfected. We must continue the fight to make this country a more perfect union. It starts with an education for our next generation, which can only function properly if all of its citizens are properly educated. Now, roughly 150 years later, another Illinois politician shared his unyielding faith in the decency and generosity of the American people. He said, "This nation is more than the sum of its parts, that out of many we are truly one." That is our national motto. And for centuries, our country has attracted people in search of a share of the American dream from all corners of the world. He talked about the men and women of every color and creed who serve together and fight together and bleed together under the same proud flag. Then he added, "For we have a choice in this country. We can accept a politics that breeds division and conflict and cynicism." He powerfully challenged us. We can come together and say, "Not this time." This time we want to talk about the crumbling schools that are stealing the future of Black children and white children and Asian children and Hispanic children and Native American children. This time we want to reject the cynicism that tells us these kids can't learn, that those kids who don't look like us are somebody else's problem. The children of America are not those kids. They are our kids, and we will not let them fall behind in a 21st century economy. That man was Barack Obama, a Democrat who later became the first Black president of this country. It's easy to focus on the divisions of America, but we have so much more that unites us. And as Tennesseans, it's those values we must embrace. I rise in support of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you for your comments.
Representative Johnson and Knox.
Couple of quick things. One thing, addressing a different part of the bill, just wanted to say the name Twyla Cannon. There's a Tennessee teacher named Twyla Cannon who worked really hard over the summer until now, making sure that the teacher certification for former Tennessee residents got fixed. And she's very proud of the fact that that is something that we are addressing as a body. So I just wanted folks to know that she worked really hard on that. The other thing is, I think it's important to talk about, we've taught critical race theory since the beginning of schools in this country. White is a race. So I think it's time that we make sure that we're teaching the truth and we're teaching everyone's truth. And sometimes the truth and facts are not impartial. And to ignore who somebody is and where they come from is to ignore them. And so unfortunately, this bill reminds me of the kind of bills they have in Washington, D.C. We always say we're different than D.C., but this bill is loaded down with a whole bunch of different ideas and different amendments. Some are good and some are terrible. And it's unfortunate that this last one makes it impossible, I think, for folks who care about everyone in the school building to vote for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you for your comments.
Representative Love.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your patience. Bill sponsor, and we discussed some of this in committee yesterday. I think for me, the issue is in the discussion of racism. When you talk about a Martin King and you present that in the class, when a teacher has that subject matter to cover, if a student asks, what did Martin Luther King do to get a national holiday named after him? The teacher has to talk about his efforts to overcome racism. The teacher talks about John Lewis. At some point, the teacher has to discuss his efforts and even the brutal attacks on him. If a teacher discusses the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision from 1957, at some point the teacher has to speak about the fact that Dred Scott was told that he was not a citizen, but was property, and that he and everybody like him was never thought about as citizens, and the Constitution doesn't apply to them. If students in their history class talk about the subject of redlining, at some point the teacher has to discuss the government actually saying to developers, you cannot receive a government subsidy to build homes if you intend on selling them to African Americans. And so, and these are factual things. I think what also is difficult is the fact that oftentimes our history books couch the existence of African Americans starting with slavery, when the truth be told, the existence was before that. The existence was people who lived in Africa who were captured and bought and then enslaved. And so those are the concerns I have, is that when we talk about presenting these subject matters in our state standards and the restriction, I don't want a teacher to feel as though they cannot go deep into these subject matters for fear of having state funds withheld in case someone feels as though it was not an impartial presentation. Are you concerned about teachers feeling as though they cannot delve deep into subjects like racism and how Black Americans were treated in that period from 1619 until Civil Rights Act
Chairman Reagan.
of 60?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The direct answer to your question is no, I'm not concerned about that. Our state standards, and I'll quote one for you, 5.24, which is in the 5th grade, analyze key points and events of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolent protest, Montgomery bus protest, and Rosa Parks, Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, Freedom Riders, and Diane North. Let me mention another one to you from the first grade. Identify and describe the events of people created during the following national holidays and explain why we celebrate them. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I won't rest on President's Day, Memorial Day, etc. So no, I'm not concerned. This bill is about adding clarity to what discussion surrounds these standards, which are required to be taught by our state school board. Thank you.
Representative Love.
Thank you. And just one last thing, Speaker. And members, that's my concern, is that even though it's in the standards, and I hear your point, I just have concerns that a teacher may not feel comfortable doing the deep dive into the conversation about what caused a Martin King to engage in civil rights and why was it written into the Constitution that for purposes of assigning members of Congress that Black Americans were only 3/5 of that count. And so those are my concerns. And members, that's what the issue I raised yesterday, and I still have those concerns. I would prefer really, if we're gonna pass this, that we at least maybe put it off till 2022, January, giving teachers time to prepare to navigate this new law with the proper guardrails that they may need to make sure that they don't do anything that jeopardizes their funding for their schools. So for me, again, that's the concern I have, that it's a slippery slope, that we start prescribing these restrictions, and that the history factually is not going to be taught in a proper manner. But thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, sponsor.
Thank you, Chairman Reagan.
Thank you for your comments.
Representative Akeem.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sponsor, would you yield, please?
Chairman Reagan, he does.
All right. Let me say firstly to you and to my colleagues, I love all of you from my heart. I love all of you. And any perception that I would knowingly or consciously be disrespectful is unfounded. That's what I want to say, particularly to you, sir, and to my colleagues here in the House. Now, to what is before us today, when you talk about state standards, am I to understand that what is being taught now is you believe it's sufficient, or can it be improved upon? When I say improved upon, a broader understanding or interpretation of the involvements of Black people in particular in the Tennessee, the American concept of freedom and democracy.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One would be a fool to say that improvement is never possible. However, I believe that our state standards are adequate. I believe that our teachers are educated, licensed, and hired to teach according to our state standards. This amendment that we're talking about does nothing but clarify that particular problem.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear what you're saying, sir, but you said something earlier about, if I'm stating you correctly, that you don't care about, I believe it was what is not being taught. And I guess what's troubling me is that perception at times become reality. And if it's perceived that this state doesn't want to talk about, doesn't want to be a part of a broader discussion in regards to our history, is that we're not as democratic as we propose to be.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you for your comments, sir.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's probably not your intent, but we're not addressing I guess the elephant in the room is that the value and worth of all people should be discussed in our history and our social studies. But the best you can give me is thank you for your comments, sir. And I'm asking, what is the problem with a broader understanding of our American history? I'm not talking about blaming individuals for what has happened in the past, but if we want to give people that broader understanding of history, our heritage, and our culture, we have to talk about it or put it in our history books.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would respond to you, sir, that if you're concerned about the breadth and depth of the discussion of history, the proper avenue to address that is in our state standards, which are in fact promulgated by the state school board. The state school board put forward these, and there are 15 pages of them, and I have the website if you care to look it up. I have printed off just some of these as examples of issues that are already in our state standards to, I hope, forestall your concerns. We already have the kinds of things you're talking about in there. The idea is that what is in our standards is what our teachers are hired to teach. This is in K through 12. Our teachers are given specific guidelines and they're expected to adhere to them. That's what this amendment to House Bill 580 is about.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know you'll let me know if I'm off message. But some of the things that Representative Love brought up deal with redlining and things of that nature. In reality, in the area of education, in the area of standards, we can also be participants in what is commonly referred to as systemic racism, the way a system is built. And again, it may be just my perception. I'm gathering from what you're saying, you're satisfied with the way things are, as opposed to expanding the knowledge and understanding of all of our children.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the answer straightforwardly to your question is no, I'm not satisfied with the way things are. Quite straightforward, we've had long discussions. Only 37% of our third graders are reading on grade level. Only 28% of our eighth graders do so. More than 20% of our high school graduates that enter college must take remedial courses before being able to do college level work. These statistics indicate that far too much classroom time is devoted to things that do not adequately teach our students reading, math, science, and other essential academic skills. Frankly, until the statistics I've just cited are turned around, classroom time should be not devoted to the divisive concepts I've cited in this bill, but rather they should be minimized. Academic instruction that prepares our young students ultimately to gain decent employment and become good, productive citizens should be the concern of our classrooms above all else.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The items, Mr. Sponsor, that you say is divisive. If you allow young people to get in history, understand the history, the heritage, and culture, there will be less of what we call bad behavior and criminal activity and so forth. I'm saying that by affording people a greater understanding of themselves and you, sir, and all of us, an understanding of each other, our value and worth, that is worth. I don't see it as trivial. I see it as important to us moving forward as a nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Reagan.
Comments?
Members, you can keep raising your hand. I got a list. You don't have to keep raising it. I got you. Representative Lafferty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've sat here praying for about 5 or 10 minutes about how I'm going to try and address this body in this issue. Still not sure I have the answer, but if you guys will bear with me, I'll see where it takes us. I've heard referenced in here, as you all have, the three-fifths compromise that was made long ago. Quick question for all of you and anybody watching. I challenge everybody that can hear my voice. Pull out a piece of paper, write down why that compromise was reached. If you don't know, don't look it up. Be honest with yourselves. Be honest with your friends and family. What do we know about our history? What do we know about our founding? The three-fifths compromise, and I've not looked this up, I'm rolling off of memory here, so bear with me, came after we decided to declare our Declaration of Independence to Britain, who was at the time a world power that we can't comprehend today. They wrapped the entire globe. We were a speck on a cow's butt that stood up and told them, we're not going to take your garbage anymore. We don't tell that story these days. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Slavery at the time was a part of world history. We drug that with us. Our founders, who we don't quote anymore, we can go and see their writings anywhere, anytime we want to, because we've got these computers in our pockets these days, or we can make the trip to DC and look at their libraries. They wrote frequently and for long times about what this stain of slavery would do to our country. They knew that there would be a reckoning, and they warned us about it. Nobody I've heard, I'm not going to point fingers, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to start to do that. I have not heard anybody talk about the words of the men that founded this country, that put this together, that gave us this opportunity to be here today, to live in the greatest country in the world. We have so neglected what it was that set us apart from the rest of the world that I'm ashamed today. I'm ashamed at how we have let it go to pot like we have, that we are at each other like we are, that we have to have legislation to talk about what it is that we're teaching in our classrooms. I'm sure everybody's finished writing down their answer to the three-fifths compromise. I'm going to go back to that for just a second. The northern states, and again, something you don't hear about in the dialogue today, the northern states for a long time had abolitionist movements. Europe, England, our parent country, if you will, had abolitionist movements against slavery for a long time. When we got to the United States of America, the northern states knew that they could not defeat the British without the help of the South. They knew it. They had to have the materials, the resources of the South in order to challenge the greatest empire on the planet. So what did we do? We're faced with a dilemma. We're faced with a challenge. Does half of a nation, north of the Mason-Dixon line for reference, try to take on the greatest empire in the world while the supplies in the South are fed to their enemies? What sense does that make? You've all ran for office. You strategize when you do that. You think you'd strategize when you try to start a country, right? We ended up biting a bitter, bitter pill that haunts us today. And we did it to lay the foundation for all of this that we enjoy in this country. For as much as we scream and fight and argue, there is no place in this world that I'd rather live and call home. The three-fifths compromise was a direct effort to ensure that southern states never got the population necessary to continue the practice of slavery everywhere else in the country. What does that mean? Appropriation based on population. That's how we pick. Everybody in here knows we've got 9, I hope I'm right, 9 state representatives. By limiting the number of population in the count, they specifically limited the number of representatives that would be available in the slave-holding states, and they did it for the purpose of ending slavery, well before Abraham Lincoln, well before a Civil War. Do we talk about that? I don't hear that anywhere in this conversation across the country. I don't know how we've gotten here. I don't know what we do about it, but talking about changing our history, changing's not the right word. Talking about incorporating another view of history while ignoring the very writings that we have access to is no way to go about it. Start with the truth. Start with what happened. Start with how we got here, and then let's move forward. I don't say anything on this floor today with any malice toward any of my friends on the other side. I say this only because I'm tired, y'all. The people of this nation are tired. If you start looking for trouble, if that's all you're bent on, I guarantee you're going to find it. Maybe that's something else we could do a little differently. Maybe we could start looking for the good in one another. What are the good things that this country has done? How far have we come? We have moved technology, science, medicine. We've done more for the human race in this country, even with our flaws, than any other nation in the history of our civilization. I'm going to close with one other thing. My daughter was working on her homework one night. I was in the kitchen working on dinner, and this has happened many, many, many nights through her 15 years. She reads one passage to me out of her history book. She likes to give me quizzes. She knows that I like history. She reads a passage out of her history book to me, and she says that the founding fathers never could have imagined a two-party system. It took me about 2 minutes to find George Washington's farewell address, and right smack in the middle of George Washington's farewell address, lo and behold, what did it say? Beware. Beware of party, because there will come a time in your history where party becomes more important than country, and when we reach that point, we are done. If we want to continue on this path, folks, we can all end up in a heap of ashes together, or we can start talking to one another, we can start figuring this thing out, and we can start making this place what it was meant to be in the beginning, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and something that you and I ought to cherish and do everything we can to preserve for our posterity. Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm sorry for taking so much time.
Out of order. Representative Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And until your testimony was told to me of what you said in committee, I didn't care too much about this bill. But with that being said, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Just a moment ago, you stated that really not that important, that we teach kids about our history. And it was funny because before we started the floor session this morning, I was just back here talking with one of your colleagues about, I said 85% of the people of either one of our districts don't even know how many Supreme Court justices there are. That's a problem. But earlier you spoke, when you started out, you spoke about the Pledge of Allegiance, but then you wanted to talk about facts and philosophy. Well, I'm gonna just give you some absolute facts that my children are gonna learn, whether they're in your cleanup or whitewash bill or not, that the Nazis were evil. That's a given. Anyone in this room who can say Adolf Hitler was not evil, God help you. I'll tell you some other absolute facts. It's evil to enslave people. That's an absolute fact. It's other evils that we need to teach our kids, that making someone else drink from a different water fountain, or they can't eat at the same lunch counter as other people, that's evil. And anyone who disagrees with that, again, God help you. People who fly planes into buildings and kill thousands of United States citizens who pledge allegiance to that flag, they're evil. And I want my kids to learn that. So I don't know what kind of standards, there's standards on paper, then there's the legislative intent you've put forth in committee, and you stand in that well today putting forth seem to be two different things. So I don't want children to learn the history of my beliefs or my politics, and I sure don't want them to learn the history of your politics. I want them to learn what history is, and there's a truth, and we all know what the truth is. We can try to whitewash history as much as we want because there's some things in our history, internment camps of Japanese citizens during World War II. That's a stain on the United States of America. But you know what? If we don't talk about it and we don't learn from it, it can happen again. If we don't learn that there has been racism in this country and people weren't allowed to go to the same bathrooms, that we created special bathrooms for certain people, then we have a problem because we're bound to repeat that racism again. And you can call it anything you want. You can call it standards, curriculum, or whatever, but it's wrong. And if you're going down that road, I don't want my children part of that. You know, that's just wrong. You know it's wrong. Trying to change what history is just so it makes some people feel better is wrong. And it's evil. Bottom line, not teaching children that Nazis are evil and having both sides of the story. There's no good side to the Holocaust. And I'd hate to be the teacher who has to bring that before a classroom of young children, impressionable minds, that maybe you teach them that, and then next thing we have, they're marching in Charlottesville. So with that being said, I oppose your bill. I hope everyone in here sees it for what it is. I agree with a lot of things Representative Lafferty said. We may not see eye to eye, but he also said we need to learn history. We need to read what our history was and is. And whitewashing it does not help a soul. Thank you.
Chairman White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My comments will be brief. As chair of the House Administration Committee this went through, I feel like I need to bring us back to exactly what the bill says. Now, the 12 years I have been in the General Assembly, I have always tried to deal with people fairly and honestly. When I quit doing that, I need to go home because I lose my reputation. I voted for this bill because I believe what I'm getting ready to say to be true. Section B of the bill, items 1 through 4, gives teachers in the classroom to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of history. What it does not allow, Section A, is that any individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of the individual's race or sex. Period. That's all we are talking about. Bottom line, and I will say this is a bill that says do unto others as you want others to do unto you, and love your neighbor as yourself, and stop the blame game. That's where we are as a nation. We want to blame each other, and we can never get over our divide as long as we keep fussing at each other and blaming each other for what we've done in history. Our history has been terrible in many ways, but it's been great too. That's what this bill does. Nothing else. Protects all citizens, all students, and especially in elementary schools where you're talking to an 8, 9, and 10, 11-year-old that's trying to understand the world they live in. Don't blame anyone. Stop the blame game. That's all this bill does. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Out of order. Chairman Dixie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honestly, to the sponsor, I want to tell you, thank you for bringing this bill, because one, we've had some discussions today that probably needed to be had. We get to see different sides of a story, and we see how our history in this particular subject arises so many emotions in people, good and bad. But we need to have this conversation. And it's a start. It's not the end. I don't know what your intent of bringing this bill was, but this is one of the byproducts of it. And it has to be addressed. And I appreciate us having this conversation, because until we have this conversation and we can teach our kids and our grandkids about these types of things, we're going to continue to repeat the same thing. Sometimes the ugly truth has to be presented in order to present change in the future. For example, and I'll open myself up to be vulnerable for a second. Alcoholism runs rampant in my family. My father, my grandmother, uncles. But I had to understand that part of my history so that either I'm doomed to repeat it or I can make a change. And I chose to make a change. But I have a couple questions for you actually on this bill. If passed, how will the Department of Education determine teacher instructional intent and impartiality related to the controversial historical topics in light of resulting student questions or discussions? For instance, if a student inquired about any heavy aspect of our state or national history, how may a teacher respond in an impartial way that wouldn't present the risk of withholding funds?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the answer straightforwardly is teachers, I think, do a wonderful job most of the time of being impartial. It's a fairly straightforward concept. One doesn't advocate one side or the other. One presents, if there are more than two sides, all the sides of the question, and does so without advocating one or the other.
Chairman Dixie.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't see this in the bill. But will the Department of Education release guidance on this, or the State Board of Education to promulgate a rule? Because right now I don't think it's either is addressed in the bill as amended.
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The State Department of Education already has the power to promulgate rules. It's
Chairman
not
Dixie.
necessary to reissue it.
Chairman Dixie.
So in the event that a teacher, school, LEA is found to be in violation of this proposed law, how is the amount of state funding to be held to be? Is it going to be determined by the commissioner and the State Department of Ed? How is that particular violation going to be levied?
Chairman Reagan.
It is at the commissioner's discretion.
Chairman Dixie.
Is there an appeals process?
Chairman Reagan.
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Chairman Dixie.
Is there an appeals process?
Chairman Reagan.
That would be entirely at the discretion of the commissioner.
Chairman Dixie.
So it's still vague, and we're going to put a heavy burden on our LEAs and schools and teachers, and we don't know what the penalty is going to be for this right now. And right now at this juncture, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Sponsor, I'd like to make a motion that we roll this bill to January 20th of 2022.
Hang on. That's proper motion, proper second. Any discussion on the motion? Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all due respect to my colleague, I move this motion to the table.
All right. That's a proper motion and properly seconded. The parliamentary situation is that Chairman Dixie has moved Senate Bill 623 to calendar of next year. Chairman Reagan has moved that motion to the table. That cuts off all debate except for that of the sponsor. Chairman Dixie, you're recognized.
As you can see, and as when I started, this bill has brought up a lot of information, a lot of feelings, a lot of emotion, and it needs to be discussed more. It needs to be vetted a little bit more. It was rushed, in my opinion, through the committee process. So I'm asking that we have more time to discuss this, because this is an important bill and it's going to affect future generations. And that's why I'm asking that we allow time for us to debate this a little bit more, and we move this to January 20th of 22.
Parliamentary situation is Chairman Dixie has moved Senate Bill 623 to calendar next year. Chairman Reagan has moved that motion to the table. We're voting on the tabling motion. All those in favor vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 67, 25 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion by Chairman Dixie is tabled. We are back on the bill. Representative Lamar, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of comments today and a lot of feelings about this bill and a lot of opinions of my own, and saying this is going to prevent us from blaming individuals when people are to blame about what they did to many Americans to create the history that we call American history. But I want to ask you a couple of questions for clarity about this particular piece of legislation and some of the comments made about debating this bill. When you were talking about this bill yesterday, I was watching, and you labeled categories of people in regards to this piece of legislation as either victims, oppressors, or idiots. So my question is, who are the idiots? Who are the oppressors? And who are the victims?
Jim Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe you're referring to the fact that I quoted Vladimir Lenin, who identified people who agreed with the Communist Party as useful idiots. I didn't call anyone an idiot. I quoted Mr. Lenin. As far as victims and oppressors, that is terminology that I lifted from articles written about the kinds of things that are in this bill.
Representative Lamar.
So I'm asking more specifically, when regarding this bill, who are victims and who are oppressors?
Jim Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With regard to this bill, that's not mentioned. As explanation, the people who were advocating that someone, because of their race, sex, or social class, is superior to somebody else, or someone likewise who is advocating that because of race, social class, sex, or whatever, someone is inferior to someone else. Those are the concepts about which I spoke as far as victims and oppressors. The groups that are advocating as being superior are classed as oppressors, and the others are classed as victims. That, however, let me stress, was by way of explanation where the bill came from. It is not in the bill itself.
Representative Lamar.
So if that wasn't in the bill itself, why did you feel the need to bring up the categories of people as victims and oppressors in regards to having conversations about the historical context of race in our country?
Jim Reagan.
I would refer you to the comments in committee. I don't see the need to repeat them on the floor.
Representative Lamar.
I find that's interesting because these were the comments you said in order to gather support for this piece of legislation. So I'm merely just trying to figure out what you mean by victims and oppressor, but I'll move on since you want to answer it. My next question is, would this bill prevent teachers from the ability to educate their students about the vicious abuse, killing, rape, and enslavement of African Americans and Native Americans throughout the 400 plus years of American history?
Jim Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill does no such thing. It reinforces the standards that are already in place in our Tennessee Code.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will this particular piece of legislation restrict teachers from going in great detail about the lived experiences of people occurring less than 50 years ago and during the Civil Rights Movement that included Black Americans not being able to use the buses or sit at the back of the bus, having to use separate water fountains, being lynched, being killed? Will we be able to go in in-depth conversation about that, even if a teacher has actually lived through it?
Jim Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section B allows that, and I will quote State Standard 5.24. Analyze key people and events of the civil rights movements, including Martin Luther King Jr. and nonviolent protests, Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, Brown versus Board of Education, and Thurgood Marshall, Freedom Riders, and Diane Nash. That is in our state standards.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you. So if a teacher was not at those particular one-off events, can they talk about their lived experiences through the civil rights movement and incurring racism in America?
Chairman Reagan.
If such experiences align with state standards, the answer is yes. If they do not, the answer is no.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you. Can teachers teach their students about current systemic racism going on in America, including instances like police killing of Black Americans and many of the other issues we have with the criminal justice system, poverty, housing, and other systemic issues impacting African Americans, which has led to African Americans being at the bottom of this state and the nation in education, healthcare, housing, poverty, and other issues that contribute to our daily life?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer straightforwardly to your question is if such are in our state standards, the answer is yes. If not, the answer is no.
Representative Lamar.
The state standards do not align with some of the more current issues that are going on right here, right now, today in America. If a student asks them about that, can they have an in-depth conversation about systemic racism going on in the country today?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is not in the bill. And I answer as I did before. If it's in accordance with state standards, the answer is yes. If not, the answer is no. If you happen to disagree with state standards, there are procedures and methods by which you can petition the state school board to get them changed.
Representative Lamar.
Okay, so can the teachers teach information about the real truth behind American holidays such as Thanksgiving, Christopher Columbus Day, 4th of July, and Juneteenth?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this case, I will quote a state standard, Case 16, which is in kindergarten. Identify and discuss the following holidays and analyze why we celebrate them: Martin Luther King Day, President's Day, Independence Day, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and Veterans Day. Those are already in our standards.
Representative Lamar.
So we can go into details about Thanksgiving was a celebration about the mass murder of Native Americans, and there was a celebration for that. We can go into details about how Christopher Columbus came to America and murdered Native Americans and other indigenous peoples in this country. We can talk about that's why we celebrate that day, right?
Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the answer to your question is if it's in state standards, the answer is yes. If not, the answer is no.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you. Yesterday, when you was explaining this bill and why were some of the reasons you brought it, you mentioned a 7-year-old girl who was upset because she was white. And that she felt like a victim. And this is a story he told. You can go back and look at the video. I'm not making it up. And I felt, pause, one, I really hate the story that the little girl felt that way. And I'm glad you shared that story because it also allows me to share the story of what it's like to be a Black child in America as well. And the trauma that Black children feel every day knowing they live their whole history in America is that we were slaves or discriminated against. Every day you grow up, you know your whole history in America was that you and your people were a slave. That's our history. Those little Black kids that I see in my district are upset that they have to go to lesser quality schools, that they have lesser quality and access to housing, that they have less access to quality food, that their family has been ravaged by a criminal justice system built on the criminalization of African Americans. Black children across this country and this state and in my district and everywhere grow up traumatized by their American history. You talk about truth and perspective. Okay, well, that's our truth. Our history in America is not positive. Everything that you said about that little girl and how she feels, we feel it 10 times more. And to try to remove the ability to have these conversations because of that, to say that someone like that is a victim and overshadow what real victimization is offensive. I really hate the story about the little girl. I really do. And I have a lot of respect for you. So it's not personal. But this is not our opportunity to forget or try to scapegoat what's going on in America, what America has done, specifically to populations like mine. American history is not positive. American history, and this is a fact, was built on the blood, sweat, and tears of African Americans and Native Americans. We literally died building America's wealth and everything that it has. And to say that we're going to limit the teaching, especially my historical contribution, the contribution of my ancestors to those single events that you talked about, and let scapegoat over, again, how Black America is less advantaged than any other race of people in this country based on how this country was started. The founding principles and all the documents you're talking about didn't include me or any of my colleagues in here that look like me, because we were slaves. Even up until 50, 60 years ago, we still didn't have the same rights, and still don't. And I will say this far as we still don't even have the same rights today. And every educator should be able to have in-depth conversations with their students about race issues in America, because race will not go away. Black Americans fighting for justice will not go away. We will continue to have this conversation, and it brings value to our education system for our teachers to be able to talk about that. So this is my first opportunity to speak on this, because I don't sit on the education committee. And it was told to me that this is a political statement, but don't play political statements with race. That's not cool. That's not funny. You see, there's plenty of us in here upset and offended that we're making political statements when it comes to our American history. Enough is enough, guys. Don't pass this piece of legislation. You know what political statement it is making. And if you don't want to be labeled the negative connotations that come with this piece of legislation, don't vote for it. And no, this is not a colorblind society. Race is very much still an issue in America, and we're going to have to address it. And I'm going to continue to speak about it. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to make my comments, and I appreciate everyone's support for not voting for this bill.
Representative Hurt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Sponsor, thank you for carrying this legislation. I fully support it. I appreciate any legislation that clarifies the promotion of equality and that will help prevent any child or person from feeling guilty of the color of their skin. And therefore, I support it. Thank you very much.
Representative Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I call for previous question.
Previous question been called. Is there objection? There's objection. We're on the board. All those in favor vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Aye, 67, 26 nays.
Previous question prevails. We are voting. All those in favor of Senate Bill 623 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Aye, 69, 23 nays, one present, not voting.
Senate Bill 623, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. Without objection, the motion reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 357 by Chairman Curcio, relative to the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on desk.
Chairman Curcio, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 222.
Chairman Curcio moves to substitute and conform Senate Bill 222, probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Curcio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 222 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Kershaw moves passage of Senate Bill 222 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call First Amendment.
House Civil Justice Committee Amendment number 1, Mr. Speaker, same as Senate Amendment number 1.
Vice Chairman Jernigan, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Same as Senate Amendment 1. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, a couple of years ago, you joined with me in voting to right a wrong, which was that 3 rural counties were being underserved in their judicial district, and that was the counties of Hickman, Lewis, and Perry. They were included in the 21st Judicial District with Williamson County. When that judicial district was created, Williamson County and Hickman County had a whole lot in common, but today you could see how that has shifted. And so what this bill before you today does is it simply says if someone is working currently in the 21st Judicial District and they want to stay on in the newly created 32nd Judicial District, keep their same job, sit at the same desk, do the same work, that they shall receive the same pay and benefits as they did in the old 21st Judicial District. With that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Chairman Kershaw renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 222, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member casts their vote, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 91, no nays.
Senate Bill 222, having received constitutional majority, I hereby declare it passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1515 by Representative Cochran relative to accommodations for transients. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill's on the desk.
Representative Cochran, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1030.
Representative Cochran moves to substitute conform Senate Bill 1030, probably second without objection. So ordered. Representative Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1030 on third and final consideration.
Representative Cochran moves passage of Senate Bill 1030 on third and final consideration, probably second. Ms. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Local Government Committee Amendment number 1, Mr. Speaker, it's the same as Senate Amendment number 1.
Chairman Crawford, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local Government Committee number 1 is same as Senate Amendment number 1. I move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
House Finance Ways and Means Committee Amendment number 1 filed as Amendment 2.
Chair Lady Hazelwood, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move adoption of the amendment, and I defer to the sponsor for further explanation.
Chair Lady Hazelwood moves adoption of amendment number 2, probably seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of amendment number 2 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopt it. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative Cochran, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 1515, Senate Bill 1030. This essentially fixes the hotel motel tax going forward. The current way that we've been doing it with carve-outs for the last 10 to 20 years, that's technically unconstitutional with the way that the original law was written. This sets the county limit at 4%, the city limit at 4%. It also secures any current hotel motel tax that's in law. It will also make it where this can be approved at a local level. It does not have to come to us every time someone needs this tax. With that, I will renew my motion and answer any questions.
Representative Cochran renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Partisan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Sponsor, I think there was some concern from our hotel folks in Shelby County about this. Does this bill speak to how that revenue is to be distributed and the purpose?
Representative Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is correct. So from this point going forward, any new hotel motel tax that's instituted will have to go to tourism. I mean, and that's a fairly broad definition in the bill, but it has to be related to tourism and bringing folks to that area and filling those hotel beds. But going forward, yes, specifically to tourism.
Representative Partisan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sponsor.
Any further discussion? Representative Hardaway.
Thank you, Speaker Sexton. I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. The definition for tourism is not within this bill, and your intent is that it be a broad definition.
Representative Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The definition of tourism is in this bill, but I would argue that it's a broad definition. Tourism means attracting non-residents to visit a particular municipality and encouraging those non-residents to spend money in the municipality, which includes travel related to both leisure and business activities. Tourism development, which is also an allowed use of the funds. Tourism development means the acquisition and construction of and financing and retirement of debt for facilities related to tourism.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you. And it's your intent that the broadest interpretation of that definition be what the municipalities use going forward?
Representative Cochran.
As long as that is for tourism, that's correct, sir.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you. And this is a permissive bill in terms of the local legislative body having to act in order to change anything concerning the tourism tax going forward, levying the tax, the amount of the tax, et cetera.
Representative Cochran.
That is correct. So just really briefly, in the late 80s, I think 88 or 89, when this tax was initially put in place, it was capped at 5%, and it was supposed to be whoever got to it first, the cities or the counties. For the last 20 years, we've kind of done special carve-outs. So if someone has gotten to it second, we'll do special legislation on this floor. It's the opinion of the Attorney General that really all of those carve-outs up until this point have been unconstitutional. This bill protects those, it codifies them, and then moving forward, it gives us a new system where the locals implement that tax up to 4%. They do not have to have that approved by this body.
Representative Hardaway.
Thank you.
Representative Clemens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to make sure we got this clear. So we're empowering local governments to enact, pass, or levy a tax or repeal a tax, correct?
Representative Cochran.
That is correct. Anything moving forward has to be capped at that 4%. Either city or county has to be capped at 4%. If they've done something previously to this, that is protected in this legislation. But yes, moving forward, that is a local action. If currently a county or a city does not have a hotel motel tax in place, if there's nothing there, moving forward, that is a local vote that they can take.
Representative Clemens.
Thank you. So we're empowering local governments, but we're also limiting them on what they can do as far as the cap at 4%. Is that 4% current law?
Representative Cochran.
So current law is 5%, but it's supposed to be whoever gets to that first, the city or the county. This sets it at 4 for both the city and the county. That number was reached by negotiations from the Hospitality Association, Tennessee Municipal League, and the Tennessee County Services Association.
Representative Clemens.
And is this hotel motel tax currently required to be used by locals for the purpose of tourism as defined in this legislation? Or is this a change in state law?
Representative Cochran.
This legislation requires it to be used for tourism. Previous carve-outs, I mean, honestly, there's probably been several uses. Mostly, I think most of those carve-outs have been tourism in the past when we've done those special pieces of legislation here on the floor. I can't say that every one of them has, but the original intent of the law passed in the 80s, I believe, would have been for tourism. That's what this law does as well.
Representative Clemens.
Well, I obviously have some concerns about that because while tourism and the hospitality industry are some of the strongest here in Nashville and the city I have the pleasure of representing, that puts an additional burden on a lot of other services here in Nashville, whether it's our roadways, whether the water system, the wastewater, all those other things, and to say or limit that we cannot use those funds for other things that also service tourists in the hospitality industry. That's a concern of mine. Could you address that and the reason for limiting that?
Representative Cochran.
Sure. I would argue that all the other services that you just named are funded through property and sales taxes, and you have funding mechanisms to make those repairs or to fund those services as those cities see fit. Tourism the hotel motel tax, you are taking that from, again, folks who are hosting outsiders in your area, and then that money is meant to bring more folks into the area. So again, it's being used to benefit the people you are taxing.
Representative Clemens.
And does this hotel motel tax and the law that you're enacting here cover bed and breakfast or Airbnbs?
Representative Cochran.
Yes, it does.
Representative Clemens.
So we're now capping the amount we can tax these types of entities as well?
Representative Cochran.
Again, technically, the law already capped it. We've done special carve-outs here and there, but technically the law already capped it. But yes, this one caps it as well.
Representative Clemens.
But it lowers the cap, 1%.
Representative Cochran.
Technically, it raises the cap because currently, in law, the cap is 5% by either the city or the county. This allows the city and the county to do up to 4%. So you could argue that the cap is raised.
Representative Clemens.
How does that apply to metropolitan governments where it's one and the same?
Representative Cochran.
I believe you would be capped at 4%.
Representative Clemens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the sponsor. Thank you for this bill. I served on local government for a few years. This has been an issue that has been discussed numerous times, but just for clarity, one of the counties in my district has a 5.5% hotel motel tax. The city, the county seat opted out. So we currently in that county, pardon me, have a 5.5% hotel motel tax. So the county, as I understand it, would be capped. They can go no higher, but the city now can come along and enact an additional 4%, which would put the entire county and city at 9.5%.
Representative Cochran.
That is correct. Yes, sir. That the city at this point, the county. You're correct. You're in your situation that you described. Your county could do nothing else. Your city could come and apply a new tax.
Chairman Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, for clarity, the county itself is not a tourist destination. So it's always been the view of the local leaders that spending money on tourism is really not a good use of funds. However, they have more than 60 different industries. It's a huge business traveling market, and they have about 12, maybe 13 hotels. I don't know how many Airbnbs. So in the private act that I carried, they were able to use this for economic development. My question, in its broadest sense, would your explanation or definition for tourism also include economic development?
Representative Cochran.
So, Chairman Howe, so first of all, my home county of McMinn is a similar situation where the county is the only one that has a hotel motel tax. And a portion of it is used for tourism specifically, as far as, funding festivals and brochures. And then a large portion of ours is used for economic development. That will remain to be the case, as well as in the situation that you described. They can continue to use that for economic development. I believe in this definition of tourism, and just in the negotiations of this bill, when we were discussing it, I think that you could argue absolutely that any new hotel motel tax, if you're using it for economic development, that would fall under this definition of tourism. Again, would be my understanding of it, especially when we were negotiating the particulars of this bill. They wanted it to be very broad.
Chairman Howe.
Well, thank you for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So hypothetically, if the city should come along and decide they want to enact the 4%, it's been my understanding in discussions with the hospitality industry, what they're concerned about is not tourism. Their concern is heads and beds. So if the city were to enact the 4% and used it to put heads in beds, whether it's tourism or economic development, under your bill, would that be allowed? Just for the record.
Representative Cochran.
Thank you, Mr. And yeah, I believe that it could. If you were using that definition of economic development as a way to bring in new people And so again, I'll go back to my home county. When you're using that to market an industrial park that maybe brings in an expansion and more employees, more people to that industrial park. I mean, most of our hotels in Athens are right next to the McMinn County Industrial Park. And so that they see those things as interrelated. I believe under this bill, you could argue, again, you would have to make sure that you're saying, you would have to be making clear that this is bringing folks in, and relate it back to bringing non-residents to your county. But I believe you could make that argument and use it for some economic development activities.
Chairman Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for that explanation. I do support the bill, and I appreciate you bringing it. Thanks.
Representative Cochran renews his motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none. Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1030 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote. Is there a member cast vote? Is there a member wish to change vote? Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 57, 15 nays, 16 present, not voting.
Senate Bill 1030 has received consensus majority. I hereby declare passed. Without objection, the motion reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 157 by Representative Beck and others relative to taxes. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Representative Beck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 0481.
Representative Beck moves to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 481 without objection. So ordered. Representative Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 481 on third and final consideration.
Representative Beck moves passage of Senate Bill 481 on third and final consideration. By second, Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
Mr. Speaker, no amendments filed.
Representative Beck, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill will extend the state tax recapture policy for our very own Nashville Predators, who I must say are looking like they'll be in the playoffs this year. This tax recapture policy will keep Bridgestone Arena in good repair and any renovations. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Representative Beck renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? See none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 481 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 75, 4 nays, 4 present, not voting.
Senate Bill 481 has received constitutional majority. I hereby declare passed without objection. Motion reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 798 by Representative Chisholm and others relative to governmental tort liability. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Representative Chisholm, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform the Senate Bill 1417.
Representative Chisholm moves substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1417, probably second without objection. So ordered. Representative Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1417 on third and final consideration.
Representative Chisholm moves passage of Senate Bill 1417 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Civil Justice Committee Amendment Number 1, Mr. Speaker, it's the same as Senate Amendment Number 1.
Vice Chairman Jernigan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The same as the Senate Amendment 1. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, Amendment Number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative Chisholm, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill affords local government a 4-year statute of repose after the completion of an improvement of a light rail system. With that, I renew my motion.
Representative Chisholm renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none. Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1417 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member casts a vote, any member wish to change the vote. Beck, aye. Lamberth, aye. Garrett, aye. Curcio, aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 87, no nays.
Senate Bill 1417, and received constitutional majority. I hereby declare passed. I object to the motion. Reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1509 by Representative McKenzie and others relative to child care. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on desk.
Representative McKenzie, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform with Senate Bill 1104.
Representative McKenzie moves to substitute and conform with Senate Bill 1104. Probably second. Without objection, so ordered. Representative McKenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1104 on third and final consideration.
Representative McKenzie moves passage of Senate Bill 1104 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Health Committee Amendment Number 1, Mr. Speaker, it's the same as Senate Amendment Number 1.
Chairman Terry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, Amendment Number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative McKenzie, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill does two things. It authorizes the Boyd Center for Economic and Business Research to utilize alternative methodologies and how they suggest that we reimburse child care facilities. It also encourages shared services and alliances to help prove the quality of our child care facilities, combining things like the accounting department, cafeteria, food prep, things of that nature. And with that, I renew my motion.
Representative McKenzie renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1104, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 90, no nays.
Senate Bill 1104, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. I object to the motion. Reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1534 by Representative Weaver relative to licensure.
Representative Weaver, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 1534 on third and final consideration.
Representative Weaver moves passage. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Education Administration Committee Amendment Number 1.
Chairman White, you're recognized.
I don't have 1534. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to withdraw in favor of finance. Which one? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to adopt.
Chairman White moves adoption amendment number 1. Probably seconded. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Representative Weaver, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House Bill 1534 deals with recruitment and retention of our teachers. Without high-quality teachers in our public schools, our students suffer. Generally, if a teacher would like to add an endorsement, they are required to attend an educator preparation program and submit qualifying scores on an assessment. Data from the beginning of the school year indicated that 139 districts had approximately a shortage of 1,070 vacancies or teachers, which would include unfilled positions and positions filled with a teacher who is teaching without a license or outside of their endorsement. House Bill 1534 helps address this issue by requiring that the state board approve a process that gives school districts the ability to create teacher training programs that provide the requisite content knowledge for additional endorsements at a local level. So under this bill, teachers would receive the training needed to add an additional endorsement without being required to enroll in an educator preparation program. This bill does require a teacher to take an assessment to add an endorsement unless they have been teaching for more than 6 years, received above expectation or significantly above expectation, which is a level 4 or 5, on their most recent evaluation. This exception, however, would not apply to a teacher if they are adding an endorsement in grades K through 3 based on the Tennessee Literacy Success Act passed during the special session. So the goal of the alternative endorsement pathway created under this piece of legislation is to increase retention of high-quality educators by providing additional flexibility at the local level and thus benefit our students. This is especially wanted in the rural areas where they'll grow their own teachers in their own district. It saves money, it gives flexibility, and it certainly does benefit our teachers, and I move passage.
Representative Weaver renews her motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Johnson and Knox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the sponsor, is the only thing that this bill does address new endorsements?
Representative Weaver.
If a teacher is currently 6 years or, been teaching 6 or more years and is highly 4 or 5 evaluated, that teacher is exempt.
Representative Johnson.
So, but my question is, this bill only addresses new endorsements for current teachers under the guidelines that you just stated.
Representative Weaver.
Correct.
Representative Johnson.
Okay. So I know in committee, we talked about how this was going to help keep teachers in the field. And I think that really, this is an opportunity to allow people to teach something different if they are have the skills to teach that. But the reality is, if we really want to keep teachers, what we really have to do is address salaries to a degree that is meaningful to teachers. But I appreciate this, and if this bill only addresses adding endorsements, then I think that would be of some benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 1534 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member voted, as any member wishes to change their vote. Ogles, aye. Cheryl, aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 85, no nays, one present, unvoted.
House Bill 1534, having received the constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion reads series table. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 780 by Leader Gant, relative to regulated professions. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Leader Gant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 771.
Leader Gant moves to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 771, probably second without objection. So ordered. Leader Gant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 771 on third and final consideration.
Leader Gant moves passage of Senate Bill 771 on third and final consideration, probably second. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Commerce Committee Amendment number 1. Mr. Speaker, it's the same as Senate Amendment number 1.
Chairman Vaughn, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the same as the Senate Amendment 1, so therefore today I will courageously withdraw it.
Without objection, amendment number 1 courageously withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Lear Gant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an administration bill, and this legislation includes proposals from the regulatory boards and their directors, addresses a recent lawsuit. It also creates a deduplication exemption for certain licensees and allows for easier access to the reserve fund accounts for enumerated uses. And Mr. Speaker, I also need to read into the record, as I did in committee, for purposes of this needing to be recorded. After considering and discussing, the department will set an internal practice that regulatory boards' reserve funds will strive to maintain 25% of the previous fiscal year's total budget for any given program. This calculation would allow the department to approve spending for strategic items related to a given program industry while protecting against market volatility and fluctuations and protecting the sustainability of each program. Any reserve spending would be for specific items related to the program from which the monies came and must be approved by commissioners from TDCI and F&A. Additionally, funds would not be spent in a way that would put a program at risk of violating its self-sufficiency requirement found in TCA 4-29-20, found in TCA 4-29-121. With that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Lear Gant renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 771, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member casts a vote, see member wish to change their vote. Haston, aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 86, one nay.
Senate Bill 771 having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. I object to the motion for reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1383 by Chairman Todd, relative to retirement for certain law enforcement officers. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill's on the desk.
Chairman Todd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1185.
Chairman Todd moves substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1185. Probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1185 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Todd moves passage of Senate Bill 1185 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House State Government Committee Amendment number 1. Mr. Speaker, it's included in Senate Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kiesling, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment does rewrite the bill. We're going to defer to the sponsor for further explanation. We do move to adopt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman Kiesling moves adoption of amendment number 1. Probably second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Todd, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't sign on to any other bill today, this is one you need to sign on to. It's a good bill. I'm sure you've heard that once before. Your local law enforcement agencies need help. They have vacancies. I guarantee you every one of them does. This allows retired officers, many of whom are forced to retire based on the rules at a certain age, they can come back to work for law enforcement agencies and not hurt their TCRS benefits. Right now, they're limited to 120 days a year to work. This will allow them to work on an annual basis. There's some reporting requirements and some other requirements that we have worked out with Treasury so that we do not harm the TCRS. And in fact, I think it will actually benefit long-term. But we've got mechanisms in here that we've worked out with Treasury, and I think this is a really good situation we're in for our law enforcement agencies and those that are still trained and certified to be able to work in our communities. With that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Chairman Todd renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1185 as amended, vote aye. When the bell rings, those opposed, vote no. As every member casts a vote, seeing member wish to change the vote. Lamberth, aye. Sparks, aye. Garrett, aye. Reedy, aye. Camper looks like aye. Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 89, no nays.
Senate Bill 1185 having received constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. Motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 869 by Chairman Zachary, relative to public health emergencies.
Chairman Zachary, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 869 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Zachary moves passage, properly second. Ms. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House State Government Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Keesling, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment does rewrite the bill, and we'll defer to the sponsor for further explanation. We move to adopt.
Chairman Keesling moves adoption of amendment number 1, properly second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Zachary, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the bill in front of you is the result of the ad hoc committee that was put together this summer by Speaker Sexton, Speaker McNally, to discuss executive powers during a state of emergency. This is directly related to Section 582107. We had testimony from around the country, and there was consensus that based on how our statute is drafted, it basically allows the governor to take any steps other than touching our weapons. And so after much discussion and deliberation, the bill you have in front of you is what was voted on unanimously by the House members. Let me first say what this highlighted and what this ad hoc committee and what we walked through highlighted was how measured and steady Governor Lee has been in his leadership and how different our state could have been without his leadership because of the powers given to the governor during a state of emergency. So what this piece of legislation does, specifically again related to 582107, there's three different areas when a state of emergency could be declared: a natural disaster, security threat, and during a health crisis. So what we have done is created a new section within 582107 directly related to health. This has no impact on natural disaster or state of emergency, the state of emergencies declarations that could be declared by the governor. So what we've done, just specifically related to the section of health, this bill creates a legislative council. Let me back up quickly. What we did is we looked at all the states across the country. We were only one of 12 states that has no legislative engagement within a state of emergency, one of 12 states at the time of our ad hoc committee. And so what we did is we looked at other states and tried to take best practices from other states, and that's what you see in this bill in front of you. So again, I've mentioned the fact that we're creating a new section related to health. This would only apply during a public health emergency, which is clearly detailed in the bill. So first thing this would do is create a legislative council. That legislative council would come into play when we are not in session. This piece of legislation says that a state of emergency cannot extend beyond 60 days period. If the legislature is not in session, then the legislative council can extend the state of emergency every 15 days till this body comes back in. This gives our body, both bodies, the ability to terminate a state of emergency at any time. That's point number 2. Point number 3, it provides a 30-day optional mark. If we are not in session and the legislative council determines that the state of emergency should be ended at 30 days, they have the ability to suspend until the body can come back in. And finally, 2 last points. This provides a reporting mechanism requiring the executive branch to give this body a 24-hour notice after the initial state of emergency is declared. That notice must include fiscal impact, why the executive order is being issued, and any follow-up guidance. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, members, it requires the Department of Health to report in front of Chairman Reagan and the Government Ops Committee bi-weekly during that state of emergency, providing them with reports, same as the reporting given to this body by the executive branch. So with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions. I renew my motion.
Chairman Zachary renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Chairman Dixie, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How will what is going to be the makeup of the 14-member council?
Chairman Zachary.
Yeah, Chairman, thank you. That's a really good question. So the makeup of the council is the speaker of both chambers, speaker of each house, majority leader, minority leader, majority caucus chairman, and then speaker of each chamber appoints 1 member from each of the grand divisions. That gives you a total of 7.
Chairman Dixie, you're good. Any further discussion? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 869 as amended vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 70, 18 nays.
House Bill 869 having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1389 by Chairman Todd, relative to recreational activities. Mr. Speaker, the Senate bill is on the desk.
Chairman Todd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 1080.
Chairman Todd moves to substitute and conform Senate Bill 1080, probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 1080 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Todd moves passage of Senate Bill 1080 on third and final consideration. Probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee Amendment number 1. Mr. Speaker, same as Senate Amendment number 1.
Chairman Halford, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Todd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill directs TASSER to do a study on those TWRA and TDEC managed state resources that are being used for recreational activities such as paddleboarding, canoeing, tubing, and kayaking. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll be glad to take questions and I'll renew my motion.
Chairman Todd renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 1080 vote aye. When the bell rings, those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Hakeem, aye. Moody, aye. Rudd, aye. Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 89, no nays.
Senate Bill 1080 having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 1593 by Leader Camper and others, relative to state contracts with businesses owned by African Americans.
Leader Camper, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move passage of House Bill 1593 on third and final consideration.
Leader Camper moves passage, probably second. Mr. Clerk, any amendments been filed?
Mr. Speaker, no amendments filed.
Leader Camper, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members, what this bill would do would authorize TASSER to perform a study regarding the issuance of contracts to African-American owned businesses with a reporting date to the governor and the General Assembly, January 31st, 2022. I'd like to thank Speaker Pro Tem Marsh, the Treasurer, and TASSER for their input and advice on this bill. With that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Leader Camper renews your motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 1593 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Garrett, aye. Moody, aye. Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 85, no nays.
House Bill 1593 having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 948 by Chairman Boyd, relative to certificates of need.
Chairman Boyd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 948 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Boyd moves passage, probably second. Mr. Clerk, call it First Amendment.
House Health Committee Amendment number 1.
Chairman Terry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move to adopt.
Chairman Terry moves adoption amendment number 1, probably second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1, say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopt it. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
House Finance Ways and Means Committee Amendment number 1, filed as House Amendment 2.
Chair Lady Hazelwood, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to adopt.
Chair Lady Hazelwood moves adoption amendment number 2, probably second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 2 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopt it. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
House Amendment 3 by Chairman Boyd. Mr. Speaker, was not timely filed. However, since it is corrects a typographical error, it is exempt from the amendment filing deadline.
Chairman Boyd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 948 brings some much needed reform to the Tennessee Certificate of Need process.
Just on the amendment, we need to move the adoption of your third amendment. Your amendment, move adoption of amendment 3.
Mr. Speaker, I move adoption of Amendment 3.
Chairman Boyd moves adoption amendment number 3, probably second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 3 say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Chairman Boyd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Bill 948 brings some much-needed reform to Tennessee Certificate of Need process. The bill streamlines, consolidates, and expedites the Certificate of Need process, ultimately reducing cost and paperwork in the application process. It eliminates many of the protectionist aspects of CON. It creates greater flexibility for hospitals and providers in terms of relocating within their service area, and allows for measured increases in the number of beds without having to obtain a new certificate of need. Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Chairman Boyd renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Spicki, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a quick question. Can you tell us what the population kicker has gone down to?
Chairman Boyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The county population limit has been lowered to 175,000.
Representative Spicki.
Thank
you. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What effect is this going to have on my rural hospital where I live and represent?
Chairman Boyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The population threshold really only affects non-pediatric MRI services, and it affects PET services. So if you live in a distressed county, a certificate of need is waived for any hospitals that want to go in there. But otherwise, the normal certificate of need rule we're familiar with would apply for a hospital.
Representative Doggett.
Thank you. So there would be no effect virtually on my hospitals. That was one of the big concerns that we had at home, was what would this reform do to our hospital and our rural district that is very vital to our community. But if this will not have any effect on that, from what I understand, very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 948 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Ms. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 76, 13 nays.
House Bill 948, having received the constitutional majority, I hereby declare it passed without objection. Motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 904 by Chairman Doggett, relative to criminal law. Mr. Speaker, Senate bills on the desk.
Chairman Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 283.
Chairman Doggett moves to substitute and conform to Senate Bill 283, probably second without objection. So ordered. Chairman Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of Senate Bill 283 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Doggett moves passage of Senate Bill 283 on third and final consideration, probably second. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment number 1. Mr. Speaker, same as Senate Amendment number 1.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House Criminal Justice Committee Amendment number 1 is in the Senate bill. Move to withdraw.
Without objection, amendment number 1 withdrawn. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this bill does is it allows the district attorney generals to petition for an order of protection on victims of sexual offenses or those witnesses to prevent the defendant from maybe coercing or intimidating them throughout the judicial process. And with that, I renew my motion.
Chairman Doggett renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Seeing none, any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senate Bill 283, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member casts a vote, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 88, no nays, 1 present, not voted.
Senate Bill 283, having received a constitutional majority, I hereby declare passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 744 by Chairman Curcio and others, relative to victim services.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move passage of House Bill 744 on third and final consideration.
Chairman Kershaw moves passage, probably second. Mr. Clerk, call up First Amendment.
House Finance, Ways and Means Committee Amendment number 1.
Chair Lady Hazelwood, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move adoption of the amendment, and I defer to the sponsor for further explanation.
Chair Lady Hazelwood moves adoption amendment number 1, probably second. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of amendment number 1 say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. You adopted. Next amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, no further amendments.
Chairman Kershaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill is an important step forward for victims of crime in Tennessee. What this bill would do is set up a fund where your local county could apply for funding, for some match funding to create a safe victim space inside your courthouse. With that, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Chairman Kershaw renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Any objection to the question? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Bill 744 as amended, vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed, vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change your vote? Mr. Clerk, please take the vote.
Ayes 90, no nays.
House Bill 744, having received the constitutional majority, I hereby declare it passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, as I anticipate that we are about to take a break, I need to announce a change in the schedule for the afternoon. Mr. Speaker, this is this afternoon's schedule. House Health Subcommittee will move to 1 p.m. That would be Health Sub at 1 p.m. Everything else immediately following in this order. Health immediately after Health Sub, then Criminal, then Government Operations, then Finance Ways and Means, Sub, then Finance Full, then Civil Sub, and then Civil Justice Full, which moved down from 1 p.m., and then Calendar and Rules immediately following Full Civil, with the House meeting back on the floor at 4 p.m.
Representative Partisan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do we have a means to announce when these committees are starting to all of the members are into the offices? Is that a possibility?
We send alerts to your desk phones. So if your LAs will watch for those, or if you want to watch online, then you'll see. We would expect them to move pretty fast and not be like 30 minutes, but we do send alerts. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That alert would be helpful. A text message would be helpful also, if you got that means. Seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Clemens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're right now in a posture where we're moving through these committees pretty quickly, and matters are going through calendar and rules and being put on the House floor calendar. After the deadline for filing floor amendments for those bills, does the leadership of either party intend to introduce a resolution to allow timely filed amendments for the House floor that would accommodate the conflict of that scheduling?
Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, as of now, there was no change or suspension of the amendment filing deadline for the floor.
Representative Clemens.
Yeah, I understand that. So yesterday, calendar and rules set issues and matters for this House floor session, and it adjourned about 4:19. So we didn't know what was going to be on today's floor calendar until between 3:45 and 4:19 yesterday, but the bill filing deadline the amendment filing deadline was at 2 p.m. prior to that. So my question then is to the leadership, with that understanding, is there any, customarily, we have introduced a flow motion to amend that rule to allow for timely filing of amendments. So I guess my question is, do we plan to introduce a resolution to repeal that rule temporarily for a flow motion? And if not, why?
Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, that was not included in the flow motion last year either, or I believe the flow motion before that. Members may file amendments with our office as soon as a bill passes at the standing committee. And notice for all the bills that came out from behind the budget, I believe that calendar came out for Finance Sub last Wednesday, I believe. So those bills have been on notice and flowing through the system for over a week. And as I stated, we will accept an amendment for the floor whenever a bill comes out of a standing committee. Members do not have to wait for the calendar and rules calendar to come out or the floor calendar.
Representative Clemens.
I understand that, but bills do die in committee. And so we're all under, we got a lot of bills before us and we've got a heavy load, especially those of us without legislative assistance. So I guess my question then is, it's not to the clerk, and I'm not being critical of the clerk. My question is really to the leadership to whether or not we're going to make that accommodation to be able to file floor amendments after we know bills are actually going to make it to the floor. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Pass. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I was avoiding a potential contentious discussion with a good friend of mine from Davidson County. But if we're back on matters at hand, then I would make a recess motion to 4 p.m. today.
Without objection, we're in recess till 4 p.m. By the way, the governor does have food down in his office. The governor has food.